So I've been playing that F-Zero 99 game, right?
Of course you have.
And they put out an update, so, the player count has gone up recently. And it's really funny because, when not too many people are playing, you kind of get in a groove of how good you are. But then when you have all of these people just playing who don't normally play, it totally throws off your rhythm. And because there's 99 people on the track, you get knocked around a lot. And I was laughing at how chaotic it was. And the first thing that came into my mind was I felt like Brad Dourif from The Two Towers. So what did you check out this month?
I watched Rush Hour 2 from 2001, which I had not seen before. I saw the first one probably when it first aired on TV back in the day, and I remember liking it.
You've never seen Rush Hour 2?
I had seen parts of it, because I remembered some of the stuff toward the end, but I had never seen the whole thing. The title doesn't make sense anymore, because they're in China, and it has nothing to do with... it barely made sense in the first one, but it makes absolutely no sense in this one. I guess I don't know what you could have called it, but the big problem with this movie... There were two big problems with it. Well, really, there was one big problem with it, which was the writing and the direction. I guess there were two big problems. But from that angle, from the writing angle, the movie was not funny. It's relying a lot on the interactions between Jackie Chan and Chris Tucker. And Chris Tucker's being Chris Tucker, so he's being very over the top and very goofy. And clearly that's supposed to be, the source of entertainment and the source of humor. But he doesn't actually have funny things to do or say. It's just him being goofy in general. There are no jokes in the movie. I remember the first one working a lot better on that front. And here it doesn't make sense, and it doesn't work. And as far as him and Jackie Chan interacting, they try to get some of that in there, but that doesn't really work the same way either that I remember it working in the first one. And again, it's been a long time, so I'm probably wrong about the first one at this point. And the movie made me angry when it gets to this big emotional turning point where Jackie Chan is confronting the main bad guy, basically, who's telling Jackie Chan about how his father died and whatever, and kind of insulting him. Yeah. And Chris Tucker starts trying to be funny about it, and it's like, oh man, you gotta kill him, like being over the top and like, don't let him talk anymore. Like all this, it's very goofy and ridiculous, and it doesn't work. It doesn't fit with what's happening in the other parts of that scene. So yeah, I did not like this movie. I did not think it was good. I would not recommend it. Even the action and stunt stuff, I was like, whatever. And from a directing standpoint, the entire movie feels very generic. It's very much a Hollywood studio product, where it's just being very innocuous and bland. So, yeah, I did not enjoy it. I know there's a Rush Hour 3.
Yeah, so maybe in 20 years you'll watch that one too.
Yeah, when I forget how bad this one was.
I read at one point that Jackie Chan himself didn't understand why the Rush Hour movies were supposed to be funny, because he didn't find them funny.
Yeah, he says that about a lot of his Hollywood movies. And now I can see what he's talking about. I haven't watched another one in a long time. I remember liking Shanghai Noon. Yeah. I don't know if I saw all of Shanghai Nights, but I think I remember liking that one too, maybe.
You gotta bust out the tuxedo.
Oh, man. I did see that one back in the day. With freaking, who is it, Jennifer Love Hewitt? Like, they were just trying to pair him up with whatever random person they could pull out that wasn't already working on something at the time. And, yeah, it was not a good strategy.
You gotta bust out. See, I'm trying to think of the terrible Jackie Chan movies now. Around the World in 80 Days, man.
Oh, man. That was one that I was absolutely not going to watch. So what do you think of Rush Hour 2? Because you're probably more familiar with it than I am.
Yeah.
What is your opinion?
I also don't think it's funny. I enjoy the Jackie Chan action stuff. I think if you removed Chris Tucker, yeah, like you were saying, the scenes where serious stuff is going on, I guess it would be more of like a Chinese Jackie Chan movie.
Kind of, yeah, but not a good one. Some of his movies are not good outside of his stunt stuff. Like, it feels like just an excuse to string all the action together. But some of them are really good.
Yeah. Think of that one I watched where he's the chef.
Mr. Nice Guy.
Yeah, that was one of those movies where the movie had a plot, supposedly, but I was just waiting for the action scenes, and they all just kind of strung together.
And even the way this movie kind of plays out like that, it didn't feel natural. It didn't feel like it built up to things. It just kind of went along. it wasn't structured well. So really, I would say the writing is the biggest problem with the movie.
Who wrote that one?
I don't know. Some asshole. I watched Okinawa, which was a movie from 1952 set in World War II. It has something to do with Okinawa. I don't remember. It was not good. It doesn't matter because this movie sucked. The only recognizable actors for me were Cameron Mitchell. This had to be one of his earliest movies. And Richard Denning, who's in a ton of sci-fi stuff. It felt like, from the studio's side, they had a lot of stock footage from the war lying around. And they said, how can we make a cheap movie out of this? So the movie is barely over an hour long, but it feels like it's way longer than that. Every single character is a caricature and super over the top and ridiculous. There are lots of absolutely insipid running jokes throughout the movie. The only good thing about it was seeing the real war footage. And there were a handful of legitimately really cool special effects shots with miniatures that had to have come from other movies. There was no way they did that for this movie. So no reason to watch it. It was absolutely terrible. Skip Okinawa. I watched Pacific Rim Uprising from 2018.
You know, I watched Pacific Rim with somebody, and they asked, did they ever make another one? And I was so confident when I said, no, there's no point. And then I realized maybe a week later that they did make another one. So tell me about this movie.
Yeah, well, they not only made another one, they also made an animated series on Netflix, which I have not watched. I've heard that it's good. This one, I had heard nothing but terrible things about, just on the internet, just reading about it. It seemed like people talked about it like it was the worst thing ever. So I liked the first Pacific Rim. It didn't blow me away or anything. It's never going to be one of my favorite Guillermo del Toro movies or one of my favorite kaiju movies.
Did Del Toro have anything to do with the second one?
As far as I know, he was not involved with the second one at all. But yeah, I thought the first one was fine. It did its job. It was exactly what it said it was going to be, and I enjoyed it for what it was. Despite all the CGI. Some of it was too CGI, like just too much of ridiculous non-physics stuff. But I like some of the monster designs. The ideas are cool enough. I thought it was a fine movie. For this sequel, it felt like the producers said, what would kids want to see in a movie like this? And their answer was, we have no idea, but we're going to make the movie from that approach anyway. So it felt like a Nickelodeon version of the first movie. It was weird. It was completely a different approach because the first movie was not like that. It was just a movie. But this one feels like they're trying to do a kid's movie, which made it even weirder when characters would swear because it didn't happen that much and it felt very inappropriate and out of place. So Idris Elba has a son all of a sudden, and they act like that was just a thing the whole time, even though I don't think there was any kind of reference to something like that in the first movie, because it would have had nothing to do with it. His son is played by John Boyega, who's fine. All the actors are fine in this movie, but the movie doesn't really work. It's filled with really lame, predictable character arcs. You've got some really bad green screen work at times. It's weird that it's a movie about giant robots fighting kaiju, but the entire first half does not have any kaiju battles in it at all. Instead, you have some, and I appreciate that they at least tried to go in a different direction with the story. They call the robots Jaegers. They have some rogue Jaegers that they don't know who's controlling them or what exactly they're trying to do, but they have to fight the Jaegers. And I'm going to spoil this because I don't think anybody cares about this movie. So in the first movie, you had Charlie Day as one of the comedic relief characters.
Right.
And at one point, he drifts with one of the kaiju brains, like he connects himself with it to try to find out what the aliens are doing or whatever, because the kaiju are being sent by aliens from another dimension. So Charlie Day is back in this movie, and he's still being his normal Charlie Day goofy self, but just like Chris Tucker in Rush Hour 2, he doesn't actually have anything funny to do, and his role in the movie is not a comedic role. Like, it's not supposed to be. He's a more serious character in this movie because he turns out to be the villain. It turns out that he's being controlled by the aliens now that they've connected to his brain, they're controlling him, but he's still acting goofy. So when your main villain is Charlie Day acting goofy, it doesn't work. It's not a good idea. Don't do that. But that's what they did. There's a revelation pretty late in the movie as to what the monsters were really after the whole time, even back in the first movie. And conveniently, nobody figured it out until right at that moment when they need to know. And it's John Boyega because he's the main character. And he's like, oh, I figured out what the monsters are really after. Which it turns out they're going after Mount Fuji. Like their paths are all like, if you draw a line from them, apparently nobody ever tried this. Nobody in this universe, there's no conspiracy theorists, apparently. Nobody connected all the lines and said, hey, they intersect at Mount Fuji. The lines of the paths that they were taking through the cities that they were supposedly there just to attack or whatever. And I'm sure if you go back to the first movie, this doesn't line up with what was actually happening, but this is what happens in this one. And they're trying to get there because there are rare earth elements that they need to do something. I don't remember what. I think their kaiju bodies interact with the elements in some way or something. I don't remember, and it doesn't matter. So in the first movie, you had Gladys from Portal, the voice, doing the robot stuff. And in here, they bring her back, but they also bring in a gravity gun now. So they're just ripping off Portal as much as they can at this point. The first movie felt like it had more of a genuine international feel with all the different locations and the different robots from different places and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But this one was just blatantly pandering to China. It was very much a studio product of how do we fit all these elements into this movie. And again, like trying to make it a kid's movie at the same time. So story-wise, it could have been interesting if just the movie was better, but it's not good. There's a lot of dumb slow motion crap. There's a lot of dumb CGI flipping around crap. Yeah, not a good movie. I would compare it to something like Suicide Squad in terms of the way I felt about it, where I didn't think it was as bad as people on the internet are saying. It's more just kind of there and doesn't offer anything. It's definitely bad, but I wasn't angry or anything. I was just kind of like, oh, I guess they're making this choice now. And then that was the movie.
Yeah, see, to me, that does sound like a bad movie.
I mean, it was. It's definitely not good. I would never recommend it to anybody. I would never want to watch it again or anything. But I wasn't angry. I was just kind of like, I guess that's what it is. It was more disappointing. I watched Pulp Fiction, The Golden Age of Storytelling, which was a documentary from 2009 that you talked about before at some point. I don't know if it was in one of these videos or if you just mentioned it.
I think it was one of these. Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. I thought it was cool that they had lots of interviews with real people, real writers and stuff, but the entire thing was too unfocused. There was no real structure to it, and it didn't go in any real depth into anything. It just kind of bounced around between different things. There was a lot of weird, bad CGI that they threw in between things to keep it interesting. It felt like at one point it was kind of like a weird ad for the L. Ron Hubbard Writers of the Future contest thing.
Yeah.
So it was cool to get those interviews, but I would rather have just seen the interviews and not have it be put together into this weirdly incoherent documentary. I don't imagine anyone who's not already interested in this topic watching this documentary, but the way it's presented, it feels like it's being aimed at people that don't know anything about the topic. So I didn't think it was very good. If they had been more focused on maybe specific aspects, or even turned it into a series where each interview was a different episode or something, it could have been way better. I didn't think it was all that great.
Well, maybe, like you said, maybe you're not the target audience for this. Maybe it is for people who don't know anything about.
Yeah, but I don't see those people watching this. Like, why would they watch it then? I don't know. It felt weird. Like, it's not even a good introduction, really, I think. It's so just all over the place. I don't know. I think it needed somebody better in the writing or planning stage to make it work.
I thought it was pretty cool. I think it was Bradbury who would read people's stories for them and send back comments and thoughts and edits and stuff.
Yeah, I think that was him talking about that.
Yeah, even after he was super famous, people would just write to him and he'd be like, yeah, sure.
Which I'm sure, honestly, that it probably inflated his ego too, to have people be like, dude, will you read my story? Like, blah, blah, blah. Like, I want to get your input. But that's cool that he did that.
I mean, you're saying it like it's a bad thing.
No, I mean, I don't know. Ray Bradbury, I like Ray Bradbury, but at the same time, I don't like Ray Bradbury, so I don't know.
Okay.
There are different sides to him, and I think some of them are a little over the top. I think he's a little full of himself sometimes, but not in a way where it doesn't make me hate him like, certain other people, but it's just kind of, I'm like, I don't care what he's saying right now because he's just kind of playing into his own persona of, hey, look, I'm Ray Bradbury. I watched Porkchop Hill from 1959. This is a movie set at what seems to be the end of the Korean War, where these American soldiers just want to go home. They're convinced that everything's over. They're done with everything, but they are tasked with retaking a hill that is now occupied by the Chinese, who are working with what would become the North Koreans. The movie starts out with some stereotypical racist-ass music, and I was already thinking, wow, this movie's going to suck. And there's some really cheesy dialogue early on, but it turns out to be really good. especially from the cinematography angle. This was a black and white movie from the 50s, and normally, like, I'm not a fan of 3D movies in general, but if there is a movie that I would want to see in 3D, I think it would be this. Or, well, it would be like a Ray Harryhausen movie or something, but the way it's shot, even though it is a 2D movie, it gives you a three-dimensional feeling at times because the camera will, like, pan across a battlefield while people are, like, running across, and it gives you a real sense of depth, or sometimes it'll rotate around whatever is going on. There's a lot of good camera movement and good angles and stuff in this movie. It was really cool. And you have a lot of big actors in this movie. You have Gregory Peck, who I'm starting to think I don't really like. I don't think he's really that great. He always kind of plays the same thing. And, I mean, in this situation, he's in a war. He acts exactly the same way he does in every other movie. It doesn't feel like he's in danger or anything, or like he's putting himself into the situation. It just feels like he's playing a Gregory Peck character. So, I don't know. You had Harry Dean Stanton, who's not credited and only has, like, one line, so it had to be a really early movie for him. You've got Martin Landau. You've got Rip Torn, who is very young, and I would not have recognized if I didn't look at the cast list. I mean, he talks in a completely different way than he does when he's older. You've got Mr. Roper from Three's Company. There are probably some other people too. There were a lot of big actors in this movie, and it is a good movie. Basically, the entire time, they're trying to take this hill. They're trying to hold the ground that they gain, and their superiors, they keep getting messages saying, like, oh, it's almost done. Like, just hold on for a little bit longer. Like, we're glad you have it easy over there because we're running out of resources. Like, we need to put the resources over here. And the whole time they're like, we're barely holding on. Like, we don't have any ammo. We don't have anything. But for some reason, messages keep getting crossed where everybody seems to think they're doing really well and they're, like, all dying. So it was a good, I don't know how accurate it is to real events or anything, but it was a good story to build a movie around, and I really liked it. I watched Prometheus from 2012.
Why?
Yeah, good question.
Oh, maybe you're prepping for Alien Romulus.
Well, kind of, because I was seeing the trailers for that, and I was thinking I should probably watch Alien Covenant or whatever.
I'm just waiting for that reveal when, they say, what is it? And they turn to their scientist, and he turns around, and it's just Spock.
Well, that's what I kept thinking of, too. How can you tie it into Star Trek? Well, here's some trivia for our viewers. I had tried to start my own YouTube channel multiple times in the past, always based around movies in some way. And at one point, you and I got as far as recording a discussion of Prometheus.
Yes, I do remember that. Wait, was that back in 2012?
Yeah, that was right after it came out. I think it was the same day that we watched it. And I remember the entire thing was us complaining and pointing out things that didn't make sense. But then when it was done, we both said that we liked it and we would recommend it.
No, we did not. We absolutely
Yes,
did
we
not.
did. We did. And I was thinking, this is part of why I wanted to rewatch this one before seeing Covenant, was I was thinking all of my memories of that movie are that it sucked, but we recommended it and said it was good. And I was like, how does that work?
Could it just have been from the hype of having just seen it?
I guess? I don't know.
I mean, that's over 10 years ago. Maybe we were just, we're still dumb.
Yeah, well, that's what I was going to say. I think we were just dumber than we are now. So yeah, this movie's not good. Almost nothing in it really makes sense. Like, in order to make it make sense, you have to kind of make things up for yourself and kind of twist it in a way that you can kind of add additional information that's not really there to kind of draw connections. And you talked about both of these movies at some point, because I also did watch Alien Covenant, which was from 2017. So 5 years later, which is quite a while for movies like, modern studio franchise movies. They're both bad. They both are filled with things that don't make sense. They are both filled with the most unlikable characters possible. But I think Covenant went even farther in that direction of making the characters unlikable and stupid. Both of the movies are filled with dumb meta references to the first movie. As in, they're not references to the first movie in the way of, like, oh, this is how this happened that led to this. Instead, it's references like, hey, remember that scene where Ripley won't let them in because of the quarantine procedures? We're going to do that scene again. Remember the scene where whatever happened, we're going to do that scene again. So there are references that they don't make sense because they don't make sense in the world of the movie that you're watching. They're only there so that you can say, hey, I remember that in the first movie. But again, not as an in-world thing where it makes sense of how it ties together. It's just a reference to something that happened, the way it happened in the movie. There were lots of things like that in both of these movies. Oh man, it was so stupid. Michael Fassbender was really cool in the first one as, what was his name? Walter, I think?
Wasn't it David?
Oh, yes, it's David. Is it Walter in the second one?
Yeah,
Is that the other one? Okay, yeah.
I think
So David was cool in the first one. Whoever one he was in the second one was dumb. I mean, he played both of them in the second one too, but his accent was terrible. What a bad idea to have him try to do that.
Yeah, it was so good. Especially, I felt like whoever was making the movie felt like the audience was so stupid they wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the two. So they said, you need to like just go over the top with each of them.
That could be right. I mean, they're both Ridley Scott. He's clearly interested in the idea of sentient AI, I guess, because he did that even back in the first Alien. He kind of played with that a little bit. He did that in Blade Runner, and now he's done it in both of these movies. But he doesn't actually, I mean, he's not the one writing the movies, but he's there involved with the plotting and everything. He doesn't seem to know how to explore those ideas. They're in the movie, but he doesn't do anything with them. They're just kind of there. And if you ever wanted to see Michael Fassbender kiss himself, this is the movie for you. I don't know, like, again, going back to Blade Runner with Rutger Hauer kissing, what's his name, Tyrell before he kills him. I don't know. It seems to be just like Ridley Scott has these ideas where he's like, that's the way to do it for some reason. Some of the CGI in Alien Covenant was so bad, it made me feel like watching an Asylum movie. And I'm not exaggerating for people that haven't seen it. Like, so you get a couple different types of xenomorphs, I guess. Which it kind of irritates me that people call them xenomorphs, because in Aliens, that's not the name of the aliens. That's just a name for aliens. It just means aliens. But it's become the name of these specific creatures for some reason. There are a couple of different kinds here. You get one, I think, that is basically the same type of alien as in the first movie, or in the other movies, I guess. And for some reason, in this movie, in Alien Covenant, it is really, really hard to kill. Way harder to kill than they are in the other movies. I thought that was weird, but you get some smaller ones that are seemingly way more dangerous because they're smaller, they're faster, they're harder to kill, it seems like, and they look absolutely terrible, especially when they're interacting with a real person, and that person is supposed to be like fighting off something that's not really there. It looks really, really bad. It does not work at all. I remember you mentioning the music in Alien Covenant, of how it's basically the score from the first movie, and they repeated so many parts of it so many times that it was mostly just distracting. But also, there is new music that was written for that movie, and it does not fit the original score at all. Again, it's only in there so that you can say, hey, I remember the first movie, but it doesn't make sense in this movie, and it doesn't work. In combination with that new music, it was really bad. I mentioned this already, but all of the characters, I hated every single character in both of these movies except David. And the second movie, this is going to be a spoiler for the end of Alien Covenant, but these movies are so terrible and nothing makes any sense, so it doesn't matter. You have a scene where the two androids are fighting, and one of them is good and one of them is bad, and those are both in quotation marks. And you don't see what happens, but later you see the supposedly good android leave and kind of go back to the humans. And as soon as that scene was happening, I was thinking, oh, they're going to have it turn out to be the bad android. You're supposed to think it's the good android. And I was watching it with that in mind, with that twist. And that's also in quotation marks. Thinking, is this what they're going to do? And given that that is what they did, that it does turn out to be David, it doesn't make sense for him to act the way he does. Because even when there are not people around, he still acts like he's the good android. And it only happens so that you as the audience can still be, tricked into thinking it's the good android. But given that I figured out right away what was going to happen, they clearly didn't set it up well. And in universe, it doesn't make sense for him to be acting like that in the world of the movie. So yeah, really dumb twist. I was mostly groaning the whole time while watching both of these movies. I hate Idris Elba in the first one. He can act. I've seen movies where he acts, but usually he just does that stupid squinting thing with the eyebrows pushed together and his mouth half open and kind of staring off into the distance, even if he's looking at somebody right in front of him. And that's what he does in Prometheus. It was really irritating. Freaking Guy Pearce with his bad old man makeup. The engineers also were a huge disappointment. You have this intriguing, weird-looking alien skeleton in the first movie, but in here it's just a suit, which in the first movie it was clearly a skeleton. That was very disappointing. Their design is very disappointing. Nothing really makes sense in these movies. I would not recommend them at all. So clearly I am very much looking forward to Alien Romulus.
Yeah, and if you want to watch my thoughts on Covenant, you can watch whatever month that was.
Yeah, if you want to get the wrong opinions on those movies.
I'm pretty sure I agreed with everything you just said.
Yeah, I think we did, yeah. I watched The next Doctor Who serial, I don't know what number this is, but it was called The Keys of Marinus, I think. It was from 1964. Let me see if I can even remember what it was about. It was the writers trying to kind of throw a bunch of stories together by having the characters have to go after these MacGuffin keys that are all in different planets or something. This scientist guy gives them like these teleporting watches, like the ones in They Live, and they have to go around to these different places and gather up these keys. There was a part in one of the early episodes that had some shots in first person, which was interesting. There's a point where they're dealing with a character that can hypnotize people or something, and for whatever reason, one of the characters is not affected by it. I don't remember why. And she's trying to talk to everybody, but nobody listens to her, and you get some shots from her perspective looking at everybody. And, they're looking right at the camera. So that was interesting. It was a cool idea. There was one part of it where you had some cool brain aliens that are like they've evolved to the point where they don't need bodies or something. So they're just like these brains with eye stalks in these like glass containers. That was cool. The rest of it was definitely too long. I mean, these serials in general, these early ones feel very drawn out. I mean, they're supposed to be because they just want you to keep watching each next episode. I don't know. They're not great. Those were the cool things about it, was the brain aliens and those first-person shots. I'm getting used to all the flubbed lines because there are lots and lots of them in here. So I guess they were just shooting as fast as they could to get these episodes out. I don't know. So, I don't know. It was okay. I would never go back and rewatch these early ones again, but I will keep going. I watched The Golden Voyage of Sinbad from 1973. So this was the second of the 3 Harryhausen Sinbad movies. The first one was 1958, so this is way later. You've got some connections to Captain Kronos, which we talked about before.
Yep.
This one was also written by Brian Clemens, who directed and wrote that movie. You've got Caroline Munro in both movies. Some of the music in this movie feels like it belongs in a Hammer horror movie, which is kind of weird for a fantasy movie. The music was very disjointed. There are a few motifs that just repeat a million times, but then in the middle of a scene, the music will switch to a completely different tone, but it's still the same scene. I can think in particular, there's a scene where the evil magician makes the figurehead on Sinbad's ship come to life, and everybody's fighting it, and the music shifts like 4 different times to completely different tonal approaches, but it's still the same scene. So you've got John Philip Law playing Sinbad. He's a cool actor. He's definitely interesting, but he doesn't really have a lot to do in this movie, despite being the main character. He has some weird dreams, which, now that I think about it, I don't think are ever explained, but they seem to be prophetic in some way. And he comes into possession of this golden part of like an amulet thing. I don't remember what they call it, but he meets this guy with a golden helmet covering his face, who also has another part of the same thing. Like, they fit together, and it's clearly part of some kind of puzzle, and it's supposed to lead to, if you can solve the puzzle, you can find the greatest, I can't remember what they say, like the greatest treasures in the world or something like that. And there's a villain, this evil magician played by Tom Baker, who was the 4th Doctor in Doctor Who. His name is Kora, which is just a shortening of Sokora, who was the evil magician in the previous Sinbad movie, so that's very creative. He's trying to find the same thing, so there basically becomes a race for both of them trying to get to the whatever the treasure is. And I did like the way the magician's magic works, kind of, because he keeps talking about calling on the powers of darkness or whatever, but he says every time he does it, there's a price. And as the movie goes on and he keeps using magic, he keeps like aging, his skin keeps getting wrinklier, and he's kind of getting weaker. And it reminded me of Star Wars, where in the original movies, the implication seemed to be that going to the dark side of the Force kind of does the same thing, and you end up looking like the Emperor or like Darth Vader when he takes his helmet off. And then, of course, they completely ruined that in the prequels by having it be because you electrocute yourself or you fall into a volcano or whatever. That was a cool idea in this movie, but from a writing perspective, they really undermined themselves by having the villain constantly be chasing Sinbad, so he's always falling behind, and the more he's using his magic, the weaker he gets. So he doesn't really feel like a formidable villain. He feels like, he keeps getting weaker, and he's always playing catch up to everybody else. So that was definitely not the right decision from like a tension standpoint in terms of like, are they going to be able to beat the bad guy? It feels like the bad guy's going to just beat himself. The live action in this movie was shot differently from any previous Harryhausen movies up to this point. It felt very 70s and not in a good way. There was also a lot of lame humor, which is also unusual for a Harryhausen movie. And the movie even ends on a really dumb joke that kind of recurs through the movie a little bit. It was mostly very hokey from that angle. You get an appearance by Robert Shaw, who was Quint in Jaws. In here, he plays the Oracle of All Knowledge, who is a floating head with horns and all kinds of weird stuff on his face. So you would never recognize him. But it was cool that he played that role. I think originally it was supposed to be somebody else. I can't remember who. I think it was like a big actor, but they couldn't do it for whatever reason. Oh, it was going to be Orson Welles, I think, but they couldn't get him or whatever. So Robert Shaw was just like, hey, I'll do it. And I think he did it for free even, if I remember right. But really, the reason to watch these movies primarily is the Harryhausen stuff. And this is a popular one among fans, but I have to say it's not one of my favorites. From the animation angle, a lot of it feels like Harryhausen doing things that he's already done before. You've got the scene where the magician is bringing his homunculus to life, which for me just kept making me think of the emir hatching from the egg in 20 Million Miles to Earth. The figurehead coming to life, and then later Kali coming to life, both made me think of Talos coming to life in Jason. And Kali is cool. And there's another thing that made me think of Star Wars, because that's the inspiration for General Grievous with his 4 lightsabers. In this case, you've got Kali with 6 arms with swords. But again, it's just inanimate things coming to life. You've got a centaur that is also a cyclops, and Harryhausen's done cyclopses before. I would recommend this movie for the animation stuff. And I would say this is one that it's still probably worth watching the whole movie to get everything in context. But after watching it this time, I could never see myself watching it again. I will watch the animation scenes a million more times, I'm sure. But the rest of the movie, whatever. And going back to Caroline Munro, just like in Captain Kronos, she's just there to be the hot girl on the side. She doesn't actually do anything in the movie, even though early on they make it seem like she's going to be important because she ties into Sinbad's dream. Well, yeah, she was even in his dream, but yeah, I don't think that was ever explained. So after that, I watched Sinbad and the Eye of the Tiger from 1977. This is, among fans, easily the least popular Sinbad movie. This is the one that they're like, yeah, that one's not that great. But I thought it was better than Golden Voyage overall. One of the reasons people don't like it, there's really 2 main reasons that they don't like this one as much. One of them is that you have Patrick Wayne, son of John Wayne, playing Sinbad, and he is really bad in this movie. So that's definitely a step down. And then the other thing is that the creatures are not as interesting. In this movie, you have a giant wasp, which again, Harryhausen had done giant bees already. You have, trying to even remember, you have a giant walrus. Like, of all animals that they could have had up in the Arctic for them to be attacked by, it's just a walrus. And I know he considered I think a yeti at one point, or a woolly mammoth or something. It could have been anything else, but he just went with a walrus. You have the saber-tooth at the end, which is cool. You have the troglodyte, which he's pretty cool. I don't know. There's some cool stuff toward the end. You have the Minotaur, which is like a robot minotaur, which is a cool idea, but it doesn't do anything in the movie. And there's another Star Wars connection there where the live action footage he's played by Peter Mayhew in the live action footage, but he doesn't do anything. And you keep thinking there's going to be a fight with him at the end, or he's going to fight the troglodyte who's on the side of Sinbad, but he ends up just killing himself by accident, which is very disappointing. And the plot of this movie is basically the same as Golden Voyage of Sinbad. Again, there's, in this case, an evil witch, and Sinbad are both trying to reach this MacGuffin goal, which is the Shrine of Eternity or something, I can't remember, where basically this guy that was going to be the new king of this region, the evil witch turned him into a baboon. So now they're trying to keep that secret instead of just saying, hey, this is the king. I don't know. I guess you don't want a baboon for a king because he's also losing his intelligence. But at first he still has, I don't know. The more I think about it, it doesn't make sense. But the evil queen wants her son to be the king. So she's trying to maneuver things and get people out of the way and everything. And it was interesting that her son is played by, he's a very villainous character in this movie, and I thought he did a good job. But in the previous movie, he was the comic relief character on the good guy side, and he was very goofy and annoying in that movie. So he's way better as a villain. I think the facial hair helps. I liked the evil witch, and I looked at Harryhausen, some Harryhausen books that I have to see what he had to say about these movies. And I guess they had her re-record all of her lines after the movie was shot because she originally played the role just with her normal accent, but then they said, hey, you know what, you're the bad guy, you should have like a weird accent. So they gave her like a weird accent. I don't know what kind of accent it is, but it was cool. She did a good job. I liked it. It made her a good, interesting villainess, I guess. So people don't like it because of Patrick Wayne, who's terrible, and the disappointing creatures. But I thought part of why it was better was another Doctor Who connection. This time you have Patrick Troughton, who was the second Doctor, playing the science wizard Melanthius. And he was definitely the highlight of the movie from the live action side. He's very energetic in his own way. He's very eccentric, and he's a way more interesting character than anybody else in either of these movies. Like, Tom Baker is cool in Doctor Who, but his villain was pretty boring. But yeah, I think the villain in this movie is better. But still, I mean, they're very similar, both movies. They're essentially just changing some details. And it has the same problem even with the villains chasing Sinbad and trying to catch up with him, as opposed to Sinbad having to try to stop them. So that was disappointing too. Even though I did think this was a better movie overall than the previous one, it's still one that I don't see myself watching again. Like, if it was on TV or something, I'd sit down to watch it, but I don't watch TV anymore, so that's not likely to happen. Definitely the animation scenes I'll watch. Again, I'll watch them a million more times like I have already, but I wouldn't watch the whole movie again. But I guess, again, if you haven't seen it, I would still recommend it. It's worth watching once. I watched It Came From Beneath the Sea from 1955, because I figured I'm watching these Harryhausen movies, I should probably watch the only one that I hadn't seen before. And it turns out I was not missing much. This movie is about a giant octopus that at one point attacks San Francisco, and that's the movie. There's not a lot of animation in this movie. The entire first half only has maybe like one or two very brief scenes. And instead, you have a really idiotic love triangle subplot that really is more of... It takes the focus of the movie for a big part of it, where Richard Denning is a submarine captain or whatever, and his submarine gets attacked by the octopus at the very beginning of the movie. And that scene goes on for so long. It's like 10 minutes or something, but you don't get any shots of the octopus in the entire scene. Instead, it's all from inside the submarine where they're just wondering what's happening, and it just goes on for way too long. But when he gets back to land, he talks to some scientist, and it turns out the top scientist in this place that he's going to, I don't know, is a woman. And of course, she's the love interest, but she's working with this other scientist who's the other side of the triangle. Oh man, it was really, really bad. I talked about how bad The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms was a couple videos ago. I guess it was a ways back at this point. This one was worse. This was very much a stereotypical 50s sci-fi movie from everything but the animation. It was extremely misogynistic in, like, people throw that word around a lot nowadays, and usually I'm just kind of rolling my eyes. But man, this movie was pissing me off with how stupid it was. There's even a whole conversation where the two main guys are talking to each other, the submarine guy and the scientist guy, that are both after the same woman. And the submarine guy can't figure out why the woman won't, like, immediately start making out with him or whatever. And the scientist guy is like, you know, there's a new breed of women nowadays that think they're as smart and capable as men. And the submarine guy is, like, rolling his eyes or whatever. And like, later they have the same conversation in front of her, like, while she's there, and she's like, you know, that's true, I am, like, I do believe that I'm more capable or whatever. And like the submarine guy's just like, oh yeah, I guess you're right, even though he's been an asshole the whole movie. And all of a sudden she's just like, okay, like, I guess I'm gonna be with you instead. But she's like bouncing around between the two of them the whole movie. And then they try, like, the thing is, they're trying to be progressive, I guess, in their own way, but like at the end of the movie, their way of doing that is like the scientists, the three of them are having dinner or something. And again, like, the octopus is already out of the picture by this point. So you're just like, I don't give a shit. And the submarine guy goes up to the woman and he's like, all right, like, I guess you're going to choose me, right? Like, right in front of the other guy too. He's like, let's go get married or whatever, even though, like, they've only known each other for like a week or something. And she's like, you know what? I've decided I'm not going to get married. And he's like, what? And she's like, but you can help me write my new book. And he's like, oh, okay. And then they kiss and then the movie's over. It was so stupid. It made me so mad. Oh, man. One of the dumbest things I've ever seen as far as all that stuff goes. The octopus is cool. Watch the octopus footage. This is not one of those movies where I'd say watch it to get the animation. Like, just watch the animation. And even that stuff, like, there wasn't that much. It was very disappointing. It turned out I had seen pretty much all the animation scenes already. So, you know, watch the trailer. Don't watch the movie. I watched All the President's Men from 1976. Which was about Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein exposing the whole Watergate scandal and all that. It's very much an actor's movie. There's a lot of acting in this movie. And there's a lot of big actors in this movie. Well, I mean, like, that's the focus of it, really, yeah. I feel like.
It just sounds silly when you say it.
But it was good. I liked it a lot. This is very much an example of the whole new Hollywood movement, where movies were becoming more serious and more realistic and taking a more artistic approach than old Hollywood stuff. And again, the focus on the acting is part of that. It wasn't realistic acting, which I was very much thinking about that as I was watching it, because the focus is on that so much. It's really good. The acting is really good, but it's not realistic. They're not acting like real people. But it works for the movie. It was a really good movie. I liked it a lot. The entire thing is shot very uniquely and interestingly. I kept thinking of X-Files while I was watching it, and I felt really stupid for not remembering, oh yeah, Mulder's informant was named Deep Throat. And like those were the scenes that were making me think of X-Files, was the scenes with Deep Throat, who in this movie is played by Hal Holbrook. And the main guys, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, are played by, I don't remember which was which, but Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman. And you have a lot of other big actors that pop up at various points. You had Decker from Star Trek The Motion Picture. You had, what's his name, Ned Beatty. You had Jason Robards. There were a lot of big actors in this movie. It was really good. I liked it a lot. I would never watch it again. It's like 2.5 hours or something. It definitely was too long. But at the same time, I was thinking, this is a movie that is all about real events. And anybody nowadays that doesn't know the significance of those events, I feel like to them, the movie wouldn't work because it would feel like, why am I watching this? What's the point? So it really is a product of its time in that way. I mean, I wasn't there, I didn't see all these things happening in the news and everything. So I'm aware of it more from the outside. So I'm able to appreciate it for what it is. But I also feel like I'm kind of missing out on some of it, on some of the importance of it, of how it would have felt watching it back then. I feel like it would have been much more impactful at the time. And I still thought it was really good. So I would recommend it. Not a movie I would watch again. Definitely a one-time viewing for me, but it is really good. And again, definitely too long. There were some scenes that they definitely could have cut down, but I thought it was really good. I watched Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, which came out this year, 2024.
Oh, wait, that's already out?
Yeah, I watched it on one of the planes back to the U.S.
Oh, man.
Because I was having trouble sleeping.
So, yeah, that would put you to sleep pretty quick.
Okay, so when I talked about Godzilla vs. Kong, I said I thought it was the least bad of them. It's still bad, but it was the least bad. I think maybe this one is the new least bad in some ways for like the first 2/3 maybe.
So they're improving.
They're getting less bad. They're still bad. So it feels wrong to say they're improving. It's directed by Adam Wingard, who also directed the previous one. And it definitely felt like they said, hey, you already made one of these. It was successful. Here's a little bit more freedom. So he decides to stick in some 80s music and some more modern synth music and stuff. And it definitely felt more like an Adam Wingard movie in those kind of ways, but it didn't fit in this movie. It didn't make sense. And I'm always annoyed when they take a song and recut it to kind of fit the movie, but they do it in a way that doesn't work for the song. And that's what they did here with Twilight Zone by Golden Earring. They did it in a way that was distracting and just didn't work. It was irritating. So story-wise, I don't remember what's happening. Let's see. Godzilla's on the surface, killing monsters and absorbing radiation, and they say he's gearing up for some kind of big fight or something. And of course, nobody says, how does he know he needs to do that? And the writers, their answer would be, it doesn't matter.
Because we wrote it in the script.
Yeah.
Well, not script. Let me say it. Because we wrote it in the screenplay. Yeah, that's better. Because Godzilla's not talking.
I wouldn't be surprised if they do that in the next movie, but there was a scene early on that irritated me where Godzilla's asleep in the Coliseum, and when he wakes up, he busts his way out. But I was thinking, how did he get in there in the first place without breaking his way in? So that's just one example of something that irritated me, but I thought it was really stupid. So Godzilla's doing that on the surface, and he definitely gets less of the focus. I guess that was true for the previous movie too. Kong is in the inner Earth or whatever, the Hollow Earth, and he finds these other apes, and it turns out they are part of a group that, I think they say they were imprisoned by Godzilla at some point, like thousands of years ago or some stupid shit. And they're led by the Scar King, and they somehow know that's his name. Like there's a really ridiculous scene where Rebecca Hall, who for some reason agreed to come back, she's like looking over she says something like, this is written in their language, the language of the people from Skull Island or whatever. But when they show it, it's not a language. I don't think they show anything that looks like a language. It's literally just like cave drawings. So anybody could figure out what it meant by looking at it. But she's like reading it like as if it's like hieroglyphics or something. And she says that the evil ape leader is called the Scar King or whatever. And he has this giant lizard thing imprisoned called Shimo, which is supposed to be Shimo, which is the Japanese word for frost. But it sounds stupid. Shimo is a dumb name. I don't know. Did they call it that in the movie? I can't remember. I don't know, but it was a stupid name. But this thing was responsible for the Ice Age or something, even though there's been multiple Ice Ages. Maybe it's responsible for all of them. I don't know. I think maybe they say the last Ice Age or something. But the Scar King, I think, and I could be wrong about some of this because I don't remember now and the movie was dumb, but I think the Scar King was going to use Shimo to take over the surface or something by freezing it or something, but that doesn't make any sense because then he's going to be living in the same cold world then, but he's just an ape. So it's some really lame villains. Also, Shimo does not seem that, it's not a good design. It's a very lame design for a monster, but it also doesn't, it's just not interesting. Like, yeah, it has freeze powers or whatever, but it doesn't seem very formidable or anything. It's just a big dumb lizard thing. And the Scar King is smaller than Kong and skinnier, way skinnier, and it's just a dumb ape thing. Like, it's just not interesting. They're all just these giant apes. So Kong gets his arm frozen by Shimo or whatever, and then, so then they're going to try to help him. And since it's Adam Wingard doing his own thing now, he's got Dan Stevens in there. And Dan Stevens is playing a super, it felt like they tried to take Ian Malcolm from Jurassic Park and say, okay, but he's British. So he's I think he's like a veterinarian or something, but he's, I don't know. They have him working on Kong, like he pulls out one of Kong's teeth at one point. And they talk about this plan that they had to build Kong an entire suit of robot armor, power armor. For some reason, they don't explain. I mean, I think they said to help defend against other monsters or some stupid crap.
The least bad, you said. The least bad.
Yes. Which just tells you how much worse the other movies were, I think. And they say, the government decided it was not a good idea to give power armor to a creature that's already super powerful and dangerous. Which, yes. But also, why would you try to do that in the first place to a giant monster? I don't know. It just doesn't make any sense. Plus, apparently, they had it pretty much all built by the time the government was like, hey, wait a minute, you should probably not do that. So they have the arm ready that they need for Kong's arm, and they give him this arm, and I think it gives him electric powers too or something. I don't really remember. So he has to go to the surface to get Godzilla to help defeat the Scar King and them. Yeah. So I don't know. The first 2/3 were not as bad because it felt more like a real movie in some ways. But then you get to the end where also Mothra shows up for some reason, doesn't really do anything. And I thought Mothra die in the other one? I don't remember.
I don't remember. Yeah, that's how memorable they are.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. But yeah, there's a really dumb, everything at the end was so stupid. I mean, the Hollow Earth, the way they present it doesn't make any sense, but you've got zero gravity areas or whatever. Oh yeah, the Scar King, I think, was going to do something that would negate gravity or something. And maybe he did it. I don't remember, but they're all floating around at the end, fighting each other. And it's this big dumb fight, and it's really stupid. And it's all just a bunch of CGI flying around everywhere. And the movie was dumb. So that was Godzilla x Kong, The New Empire. Can't wait for the next one.
What's the ending teaser for the next one?
Was there one? I don't remember. There probably was. Yeah, I don't remember. I don't know. All I know is that it sucked. So yet another shitty entry into the Monsterverse or whatever. And thankfully, that is everything I had time for this month, which was a lot.
Yeah, that's a lot. So no books, no video games?
Oh yeah. I read Yotsuba to volumes 5, 6, and 7, which I've talked about a couple times already. It's more of the same, still really good, still really entertaining, still really, really funny. I still highly recommend it. I like it more and more as it goes on. Lots more side characters being brought in. Some of them are really, really funny. I really liked the chapter with the robot, where one of the kids is making a cardboard robot costume for school as a school project. And Yotsuba comes in when he's already wearing it, and she thinks it's a real robot. So he decides to convince her that he's a real robot. And by the end of the chapter, she never finds out that he's not a real robot. So she goes on, just through the rest of the series, I guess, just thinking it was a real robot. It was really, really funny. And it was funny, too, when she's like, oh, he's a robot, so he must be really powerful. So she just starts punching him, and she's like, this isn't going to hurt him at all. And the kid inside is like, what the hell are you doing? It was really good. So, yeah, I highly, highly recommend it. Unfortunately, I won't be able to finish the series anytime soon because I'm no longer in Japan, and it's a little too expensive online. I think because the fact that this one is the one series that's always recommended to people learning Japanese, learning how to read Japanese, I think that makes it go for a little bit more on eBay. And it's hard for me to justify spending $50 or something on a series that I already read half of. And in Japan, you can get the volumes for literally 70 cents a piece. So I don't know. I will read it at some point, but I'm going to have to get rich before I'm willing to spend that much money. And even then, it would be hard for me to do it. I don't know. Maybe when I go back to Japan, I'll do it.
You can't spend all that YouTube revenue we get.
Yeah, if I want to not eat for the rest of, like, the year.
I can barely fit in this room. I'm just surrounded by so much cash.
Yeah, I don't know about that 90-10 split. We should rethink that. But again, this is a series that doesn't really have plot arcs. It does have more running subplots as it goes on, which I really like. There are more things that kind of carry on from chapter to chapter. I really liked the part where her dad buys some expensive milk because he says, I wonder why it's so expensive. Like, there's no way it's worth it. So he buys it and is like, let's try it out. And they drink it and they're like, wow, this milk is amazing. And then Yotsuba goes and tells the neighbors about it. And like, they all taste the milk and they're like, wow, I can't believe this milk is so good. Like, just the entire premise is just ridiculous. But then one of the neighbors is not there, one of the sisters. And when she gets there, the milk is all gone. So Yotsuba is like, oh, I'll bring you some milk tomorrow or later. But then she goes off and does other things and she forgets all about it. So then like the next chapter is her waking up and she's like, oh shit, I forgot about the milk. So she runs out with the milk to give to that sister, but the sister is like riding her bike to school. So she ends up chasing, like getting on her own bike, and like her learning to ride a bike was really funny too. But she's trying to like track her down across the entire town, but she doesn't know where she's going. So she's getting lost, and I don't know. It was really good. She eventually makes it to the school and is like just wandering the halls as this like 5-year-old girl in a middle school or a high school. I don't remember. Probably a middle school. No, maybe a high school. I don't know. And she like wanders into a teacher's room where there's just like papers all over the tables and there's like this huge stack of papers and she's like, oh, that's going to fall. I'll go fix it. And she goes and pushes it and the entire thing falls over. And the one teacher that's in there, she's like, what the hell's going on? Like, what are you doing here? She runs out scared and she ends up like falling asleep on the steps inside the school, like just some stairs in the school with like the bottle of milk next to her. And when she wakes up, there's all these students around like, what the hell is this little girl doing here? Like, why is there a bottle of milk here? And she's like, oh yeah, I was trying to bring this milk to my friend or whatever. I don't know. It was really good, really funny. So that was like a kind of subplot that ran over a few chapters.
What's really wild is that is ironically one of the main plots of Rush Hour 2.
Trying to think of what you're talking about.
No, I just made it up. I was just...
Okay.
It was a joke.
I legit don't remember, so I was like, was Chris Tucker drinking milk in that movie?
Yeah,
I feel
he's
like
trying
he
to
did
get the
at one
milk
point.
to Jackie Chan because it's so good.
I mean, that would have made it a better movie, I'm sure. But yeah, Yotsuba to, really funny. Definitely recommend it. Who knows when I'll get to it. But yeah, my point was that you don't have to get to the end to feel like, it doesn't feel like you're missing something, you know, but I do want to read the rest. So basically I got halfway through because I think it's 15 volumes. So I read the first 7 and that's everything I had time for this month. So what did you check out?
I watched The Courier from 2020, which takes place in the 60s and is based on an actual British dude who was recruited to be a spy against the Soviets to gain nuclear intelligence. And he's played by Benedict Cumberbatch. And his character is not a spy or government agent by trade. He's just a businessman. And he's recruited specifically because of that, since he won't arouse suspicion if he just keeps doing his regular business stuff, which he's really good at. But naturally, he can't tell anybody what he's doing, and it causes alienation from his wife. And it all culminates in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and his contact in Russia is exposed. So he volunteers to make one last trip to try and get the double agent out. But thankfully, it does not turn into an action movie. That was my fear. And he actually ends up getting caught. They both get caught. And in the end, some things work out, some things don't. I don't want to give too much away. I thought it was good. I thought Cumberbatch did a decent job. There are roles where he can act, and then there's other roles where it's like he's shouting at you, now I am acting. You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
It was a good watch.
It sounds like something I'd be interested in.
Probably. I watched Predestination from 2014. Have you seen this one? That Ethan Hawke movie?
I have not.
Okay. It is a movie that asks you to accept it as something super deep, but in reality, it's a pretty by-the-numbers sci-fi flick. Ethan Hawke works for a time-traveling government agency, and in one of his covers, as a bartender, he meets a guy who starts telling him his life story. And most of the movie is done through voiceover narratives, and it was okay. It's based on a Heinlein story, and maybe the story is better than this movie. There are a bunch of twists and reveals that culminate into this big thing at the end, but it wasn't as shocking as the movie thought it was. It won some awards, and I didn't think it was bad, but it wasn't anything special. I watched Tenet from 2020, because I was in a time-traveling mood, you know. I like Christopher Nolan. I don't think I've ever seen one of his movies that I did not like, and I like this one too.
Even The Dark Knight Rises?
No, I forgot about that one.
What about The Dark Knight? I hate The Dark Knight. I haven't seen The Dark Knight Rises.
I know you hate The Dark Knight, because you're all like, oh, Marvel's better. We're not talking about that now. I think Tenet went more under the radar when it came out. Probably COVID had something to do with that. Have you seen Tenet?
I have not. I didn't even know what it was about. I didn't know it was about time travel.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's just kind of this Christopher Nolan movie that people are like, oh yeah, I didn't see that one. The plot and storytelling style is typical Nolan in that it requires you to actually pay attention, and the payoff is pretty good. And as things unfold, you start to realize why certain things happened the way they did, and actually watching the movie again made it more enjoyable because you already know what's going on, and you can see how everything actually fits together very well. I know for things like Interstellar, Nolan made a point to make things accurate based on science, and for this one, he did some of that, but I think even he admitted that the whole thing might not stand up to too much scrutiny. It had the thoughtfulness of his other movies, except, The Dark Knight and Dark Knight Rises. But I could see some people losing interest if they were expecting this one to be a big Hollywood Batman movie. Basically, take out a bunch of the pandering stuff and you get Tenet. So I think you would like it.
Okay.
The one thing that did bother me, though, was there were points when the protagonist and his partners were pretending to be billionaires or whatever because they're infiltrating this organization. They need to find out stuff, but they acted so dumb. Like, they're touring this super secure, rich person only vault for shit, and they're asking questions because they're going to break in later. And the tour guide is talking about how things will go when they get off the plane, and Robert Pattinson is like, oh, so after we get off the plane at the terminal, we'll just come right here? And the dude's like, no, you'll come from your private plane. Aren't you billionaires? And they're like, oh yeah, of course we're billionaires. We have our own planes. How stupid of us to forget. That happened more than once. It's kind of annoying. But yeah, it was a cool movie. I watched Vampire's Kiss from 1989, which is that Nick Cage movie where he imagines that he's bitten by a vampire and is gradually becoming one. I assume you've heard of this movie at least, right?
I've heard of it. I didn't know what it was about.
Well, let me tell you right now. I'll tell you what it's about, and then it will save you from ever having to watch it. It is very clear that the director just told Nick Cage, I want you to be weird. Because there are a ton of very short shots in random spots where he's clearly improvising how to do basic things like move through a room or walk down the street. And then they decided to just stick all of those shots in the movie because they probably thought it was funny. And I read that Nick Cage's character in this movie influenced Christian Bale playing Patrick Bateman in American Psycho.
Oh, I thought maybe you were just going to say in his life, influenced him in his life.
And that's part of what made me want to check this movie out, but I didn't really see it. If it was the being weird part, then it didn't align, because Christian Bale, while he is odd and eccentric in American Psycho, also has the ability to act. And Nick Cage has stated in interviews that he pretty much did whatever extreme things he could think of just because they were extreme.
And who made this movie?
Some asshole. This movie is framed as a comedy, but most of the jokes run the entire movie, and they're not really funny to begin with. The only one that had some merit was him constantly hounding his secretary for this contract they need for work, but then at the culmination of the joke, he just ends up raping her and leaving her in the basement of an office building, so it wasn't really much of a punchline.
Interesting.
I mean, that's one way to describe this movie. The guy who wrote the screenplay was struggling with depression and being in a very terrible relationship, which is basically what the plot embodies. So it's kind of like, I don't know, a therapy diary, but turned into a movie. I don't really understand any positive notions about any part of this movie. Pretty much all the positive reviews seem like they're trying to identify at least something to praise, but end up shrugging their shoulders and saying, I don't know what it is, but there's got to be something. It's basically meme fodder because Nick Cage is just a weirdo doing weird things. I watched Communion from 1989, which is a really bizarre alien abduction movie starring Christopher Walken. Have you seen this one?
I've never heard of this.
Yeah, me neither. It's just one of those random choices. And it was bizarre in that it was made to begin with, and bizarre in the way it was made. It's based on a book by a dude who claims this stuff actually happened to him, but I struggled with some parts of the movie. They weren't believable. Like, he danced to calypso music with the aliens on their mothership. So he's a writer, and it's 1989, so word processing on computers was more novel than it is now. And really, one of the things that stood out to me was this disgusting thing he did. So he would sit down to write at his computer, and he would clap his hands, and he'd rub them together, and he'd be like, all right, let's go. And then before he would start typing, he would lick all of his fingertips. That's f***ing gross, dude.
Yeah, that's weird. You sure that wasn't just a Christopher Walken thing?
It might have been. Anyway, he's camping with friends at a cabin, and the typical bright light and slow motion and high-pitched sounds happens and, he gets abducted. And the next day he can't remember most of it. But something I found uncommon to movies like this was that everybody else in the house, which was 4 other people, also remembered the bright light. And 2 of them demand to leave. They say, this is messed up, we don't know what happened, but we want to get out of here. And then he takes them home, and there's really never any follow-up with either of those characters. And usually in movies like this, you'd see him try and dissuade them and say nothing happened, and then maybe even keep them there against their will. And Christopher Walken ends up going to a psychiatrist, and he's hypnotized, and he manages to remember what happened. And eventually he goes to the ship on his own instead of waiting to be taken there. And like I said, they do a lot of dancing.
This movie sounds so weird.
It is. And the aliens look pretty bad. Well, at least one group of them, because there are 2 groups. And one kind of had a Jim Henson type thing going on, and they're very short. And the other ones were tall and skinny, and I couldn't believe what they were going with, because it looked like a blow-up alien you'd see outside of a car dealership. And that's actually the face on the poster. And at the end, they explain, and that's in quotes, this terrible look by saying that the aliens are hiding their true appearance and it will never be revealed to humans, which was a really lame cop-out to say, we don't have any money to make a good-looking alien. It's way easier just to slap a plastic mask on a mannequin. It was a pretty dumb movie, and the actress who plays his wife looked so familiar, and it was driving me crazy, but I couldn't place her, so I looked her up afterwards, and it was freaking Professor Walsh with long hair.
Oh, from Buffy.
Yeah.
I was like, where do I know Professor Walsh from?
I watched The City of Lost Children from 1995. And I first saw this movie probably 20 years ago. And I really liked it. And when it popped up on some streaming service, I wanted to see if it still held up. And I think it does. You've seen this movie, yeah?
Yeah, but it's also been a while for me. I do remember liking it as well.
Yeah, the production design, the pacing, the cinematography are really, really good. It's like the transference from idea to screen was very well realized and executed. I really like the creativity of the writing and the characters, and their acting style matches the style of everything else. So this is a fantasy sci-fi film where this crazy scientist guy is unable to dream, so he kidnaps children to steal their dreams. And he's out in the middle of the ocean with a bunch of cloned dudes, and there's his brain in a tank and other weird stuff. And one of the kids they kidnap is Ron Perlman's little brother. So Ron Perlman goes to rescue him, and he gets help from other kids in the city, and they encounter all these weird characters and stuff. And it's a very creative movie. Does Ron Perlman actually speak French fluently, or did he have to learn lines for this movie? Because he doesn't talk too much.
Yeah, I don't know. Doesn't he speak Spanish in some movies? And I think he just learned the lines for the movies. I'm not sure.
Okay. Well, as they say in France, he did a bueno job. But yeah, definitely worth checking out. That's all I watched. I read this horror manga called My Name is Shingo, and they were originally written in the early 80s, but they've recently been translated to English and split into 3 big volumes. And I've read volume 1 and 2.
And that's Kazuo Umezu, right?
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of his stuff. The Drifting Classroom is one of my favorite horror mangas.
That was one that I specifically looked for in Japan, but I either couldn't find the full thing, or it would be too expensive or too big for me to fit in my bags, so I unfortunately didn't get it.
My Name is Shingo felt very much in line with The Drifting Classroom in terms that so many things are happening consecutively that only make every situation worse, but you can't stop reading because it's so good. So there's this kid, and he doesn't really fit in, mostly because he's in his own world most of the time. He doesn't really understand social etiquette, but overall, he's not a bad kid. And his dad works at this factory and announces they're going to be using a robot to help assemble whatever they do. And the kid is like, wow, and he's thinking like this huge Gundam type thing. But of course, it's just this creepy looking robotic arm. And the dad, his personality is pretty much the same as a kid with the same weirdness. He's just an adult. And the kid always gets really excited about stuff, but his excited face isn't really happy. It's like if you described what features make up a face of somebody that's excited to an alien, and the alien drew it. So the kid's eyes are always really wide, and his mouth is always just open really wide, and he's just saying like, wow. So there's actually 2 robots at this factory, and since it's new technology, they have to be meticulously programmed, and it's a lot of work. So someone has to learn how to do that. So the dad is put in charge of that, and the kid's class goes on a field trip to the factory, and they're there at the same time as another school, a girls' school, and the kid sees this girl, and he's immediately smitten. but then they leave, but then he goes back on his own later, and she's there too. And they eventually team up, and they sneak into the factory and learn how to program the robot, which is named Monroe. That's what the workers decided to name it, after Marilyn Monroe. And the dad gets fired eventually, since now they have the robots to do the work. And the kid keeps sneaking in and teaching the robot how to do new things, and who he is, and who his girlfriend is. And they're young kids, elementary age. And the kid's dad, because he got fired, he becomes a drunk, and the mom just violently divorces him. There's this huge fight, and the girl turns out to be rich, but her parents don't want her hanging around with this kid because he's a bad influence. And the kids keep telling themselves they're so in love with each other, and the girl's parents are like, this is messed up. We're just moving to England. So she's super distraught, he's super distraught, and they keep going back to the factory to ask the robot questions to help guide their lives, which doesn't make much sense because it's only outputting, what they've input into it. And when the girl finally leaves, she can't fight it. She gives the kid a message in code, but the factory has been made off limits. So the kid has to go through this huge struggle to get into the factory to input the code. And her last message is asking him to marry her. So he has to run to catch up to her before the plane takes off. But it turns out that she ran away anyway. So they meet up in this park. So now they're on the run and everyone's looking for them. And the parents are all yelling and screaming at each other, saying it's, the other family's fault. And the kids decide that now that they're married, the next step is to have a child. But they don't know how to do that. So they naturally go to the factory and ask the robot, how do we make a child? And the robot, because, again, it can only output using information it already has, puts up this message that says, jump from the top of 333. And they're trying to figure out what that means. And they eventually interpret that as, so we have to climb to the top of Tokyo Tower and jump off because it's 333 meters tall. So they sneak in to Tokyo Tower. They get outside of the public area and they climb up all these maintenance ladders and stuff, and they're going up and they're higher and higher and they're both completely terrified. And the families eventually find out what they're doing, but the kids are already too high up. And this huge storm starts happening, and there's wind and lightning and shit, and they're both screaming how scared they are, but how much they love each other, and they want to have a kid, and if they can just make it to the top and jump off, then that will make a kid. And then they get to the top, and they realize they're 30 centimeters short. And they're like, shit. So then the kid says, okay, well, we'll put down your backpack. That will give us 30 centimeters. Then we'll stand on top of that. So they're stretching way up. And then this dude in a helicopter comes by and he's like, what the hell are you doing? You kids need to get down. Everyone is scared. And they're like, no, we have to make a child. And at the end of volume 2, they jump off. And the next volume doesn't come out till October. So I just got to wait 2 months. It's so hectic. And there's not really any time to breathe between the events, but the suspense during the events is also spot on. It's a tough thing to explain, but it's balanced so well. And Umezu is really good at capturing extreme emotions in his art. He does this really neat thing of adding a horror-esque aesthetic to very mechanical objects and settings. I really liked it. And, I might go read The Drifting Classroom again. It's very clear why he was such an influence to so many other people doing horror manga. I read Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West from 1995.
Interesting.
I have not seen the musical Wicked. I have zero interest in that. I have zero interest in seeing the movies, and that's plural because apparently they're doing part 1 and part 2 because that's what we do now. But I was hoping that the book itself would be good. What exposure do you have to this thing?
Well, I work in a bookstore, or at least I used to, so I've seen the cover.
Okay. I like the Oz books in general, and the MGM movie is a childhood staple, so that was enough for me to check this out. And unfortunately, while I thought the idea was interesting, the book is too drawn out and way more superficial than I was hoping for. It's a revisionist novel of the characters from The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, which is the first Oz book, and it provides a lot of backstory for a lot of the characters before Dorothy arrives and introduces new ones, and aims to explain why specific events happened, based on different characters' motivations and interactions, things like that. There's a lot of politics involved, and while the Witch of the West is the main character, there's a lot more characters that get a lot of focus. I liked some of the beginning, and I liked some of the end, but the bulk of this book was not doing anything for me. Whatever creativity there was quickly lost in the middling of lame character drama. And it seems like whenever the author thought people might lose interest, or maybe he was losing interest as he was writing it, he'd just throw in some gratuitous sex or start talking about non-sexual things very sexually. Maybe that was to shock the reader since it was set, in Oz. I don't know, but it happened a lot.
Like what, between like the Munchkins and like the lion, or like what's going on?
Oh, just name a character, and the answer is yes.
Okay, interesting.
And this author, can't remember his name, McGuire, I think.
Yeah, Gregory Maguire, I think.
Yeah, he is milking this thing because this book came out in 95. The musical was not made until 2003. And then all of a sudden, now there's a sequel book in 2005, and then 2008, and then 2011, and then 2021, and then 2022, and then 2023, and then 2024. And now there's a 2-part movie coming out, so I imagine he's going to be like, hey, I'll just write more books. And he's also done the same thing for Cinderella, A Christmas Carol, Snow White, and a bunch of other stuff.
I mean, that's a very common thing right now, is tons of books that are just like reimaginings of fairy tales or like those kind of things. There's I think there's 2 lines of Disney related ones that are like the stories retold from a different character's perspective or whatever. They're very popular among teen to mid-20s girls right now. Even in the thriller genre right now, there's tons of books coming out where I read the synopsis and it's like they're doing Strangers on a Train, or they're doing Psycho, or they're doing Rear Window, or whatever. And it's super uncreative. And the new versions don't sound good for any of these that I've encountered. But some of them are super, super popular right now. I don't know. It's just a whole trend that I don't like.
And I read the plot of the Wicked musical, and it's not really tied to the book that close. It's a reimagining and cutting out select things that whoever wanted to stick into the musical. It doesn't follow the book very closely at all, so that made me even less interested in it. I read the last story from You Like It Darker, which is the Stephen King collection of short stories from 2024, and the last story was called The Answer Man, which wasn't that great. So it was a lackluster ending to a book full of hits and misses. That's all I have to say about that. I read Brave New World from 1932, and I read this one probably back in high school, but I didn't remember most of it, so I gave it another go. I don't know what's up with my memory, but all of these sci-fi classics are much shorter than I remember them being. Like in my mind, they're these huge tomes.
I remember that one feeling way longer than it was, because it was so depressing.
It was very depressing. So, for those unfamiliar, instead of a 1984 world where people are conditioned to believe and act specific ways, Brave New World genetically forces people to be a certain way from the single cell stage. So there's no chance of rebellion since you're grown for your purpose at stage 0.
I guess technically people would start out as 2 cells because you've got the egg and the sperm. So they would never be one single cell. But anyway, yeah,
thanks for listening. Come back next month. I was talking to you. So the wrench gets thrown into this perfect society when someone who exists outside of that society enters it, because there's still a little sects of people who procreate naturally. And this dude, John, is seen as a savage, and he laments how humanity has accepted this sterile way of life, and he encourages them to fight against it. But again, unlike 1984, where fear keeps everyone in line, the people look at him like he's an alien because they can't physically, mentally, psychologically, genetically even understand what the hell he's talking about, because everybody is where they belong.
Get to the part where they unfreeze Sylvester Stallone. That's the good part.
That was dumb. Only I'm allowed to make dumb jokes.
I mean, that's what it's making me think of, because I'm sure that movie was taken a lot from that book.
Yeah, that's true. So after some outbursts and conflicts, John ends up isolated by choice to stay away from this brave new world, and he rejects everything it stands for, and that means denying himself happiness because that's what the world represents, and he doesn't want anything to do with it. And he takes it to the extreme, and I was kind of rolling my eyes, and it was clear he was going to kill himself eventually, and by the end I was like, just do it. Because that part goes on for a really long time, and then the book is over. I liked it overall. John made his points, and he found that the entire world couldn't understand his perspective, and he was just up against this insurmountable wall. But I was hoping that more would happen to him before he isolated himself. He has the big conversation with someone in charge of part of the society who says, yeah, you're right, and here's why we did all of those things. But that was pretty much it. He just turned into a broken record, which, from a narrative perspective, accentuated the pointlessness of his struggle, but it was tiring from a reader perspective. I also found it terrifying that this book was written in the 1930s. And a lot of the sci-fi stories I've read from the 30s are full of optimism. how technology is going to solve all of society's problems. And, we're going to be on different planets and they're going to be beautiful and nothing dangerous is out there. And we just have this unbridled enthusiasm for exploration. And all of the, you're going to f everything up, seems really prevalent in the 40s. And I guess this novel is kind of a satirical look at the unbridled optimism. Because it's like, yeah, the society is perfect and everyone's really happy, but at the expense of everything else.
I remember just thinking that the mindset completely matched my mindset, and I hated reading it. So, I don't know, it was a weird feeling.
It's a very interesting read. I would recommend it.
I've not recommended it to people because I remember it being, like I said, it felt longer than it was. I mean, it's been a while, but I remember that it was kind of like I read the first chapter and I was like, okay. And I feel like that gave me the sense of what the book was and I didn't need to read anymore, but I don't know.
I played Rocket Knight Adventures Resparked, which came out this year, but is actually a collection of the Rocket Knight Adventures games. The Genesis one from 93, the sequel, Sparkster, for Genesis from 94, and Sparkster for the Super Nintendo, which is also from 94. And those are different games, even though they have the same title, and are made by the same people. The Rocket Knight Adventures games are quicker platformers, kind of like Sonic, but they are developed by Konami. It's always so sad to talk about Konami now. It's like a good friend you used to have that got involved in hard drugs and just f***ed up their whole life.
I meant to send you a picture of the Konami headquarters building that I took in Japan, and I was going to caption it like the greatest place on earth or something like that, but I forgot.
Oh, the really tall one with the even taller part on the top with like the billboard thing? It's a very cool looking building. R.I.P.
I mean, I feel like that's modern Capcom in a way too.
No way, Capcom's still doing good things.
If you say so.
I do say so. So console-wise for Sega, this was around games like Hyperstone Heist, Castlevania Bloodlines, Contra Hardcore, Lethal Enforcer, Snatcher, lots of really good stuff. So Konami was on top of shit, and the stuff they were developing for Sega was awesome. And I'm just saying Sega, even though Sparkster was also on Super Nintendo, because that game feels like a Genesis game in a trench coat. If you showed me gameplay footage of Sparkster for Super Nintendo, I would say that's a Genesis game, apart from the music. But it looks, it plays, it feels like a Genesis game. It's really weird. Konami was doing really good in terms of arcade titles around this time too. And I think they used Sparkster as a mascot for a while. In terms of platforming, there's a ton of really neat ideas and the ways that they use the hardware. It's like someone would have a really creative idea and somebody else said, if we can't do it, we'll find a way to do it. And then they did. The games have a 90s era difficulty, but that's something I really like about that era because with practice, you could blow through it and feel accomplished. And the games were not blatantly unfair, even though they were hard. And that's another thing. Once you're good at a game like this, you can really appreciate the amount of effort that went into it because you're not so focused on just staying alive. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I guess you could do that nowadays anyway with, YouTube and stuff. So if you want to check out any of these Sparkster games being played, just go find it on YouTube. So the music for at least one of these games is Michiru Yamane and Akira Yamaoka.
Okay.
It's like Silent Hill, but with possums.
I have tried listening to some of his other stuff, and yeah, some of it is very different from Silent Hill.
Well, once he started torturing people in his basement in real life to get inspired, it changed his whole outlook.
For the better.
And the last thing I'm going to talk about for the longest time is the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which came out in 2020. I like Final Fantasy VII. I played through it more than a few times. It's a solid JRPG, and Square denied making a remake for years, saying it would take too long, but they finally announced it in 2015. And then they said nothing for several years. And I think the 2015 announcement was because higher-ups at the company felt like there wasn't anything big enough that year to announce, and they needed to keep the boat afloat. So they said, yeah, let's just announce a 7 remake. And that was 2015. And we didn't get anything until 2018, which is 3 years later, and it was just a couple of pictures. There wasn't actually any footage until 2019. So that's 4 years between announcing something and seeing anything. But it finally came out in 2020 for PS4, and then a souped-up version came out for PS5, and I finally got around to playing it in 2024, and it was good. So what they did is they took this big narrative of the original game, and they sliced out the opening part, and they said, this is the Final Fantasy VII Remake. basically just the opening act of the original game, but that's the entire game, which is a pretty bold move. And I put in about 40 hours, and I did pretty much everything, and I dabbled, into the New Game Plus stuff too. Visually, it's just phenomenal looking, and I was playing the PS5 version. I imagine the PS4 version looks good too. The amount of effort that went into designing Midgar, which is the city that you're in, is very apparent. And to make up for, 90% of the story missing, there's a lot more storytelling for side characters and a little bit more running around. Some areas feel puzzly just to draw out the runtime, but it's not overly offensive, and there's usually some kind of good reward for doing it. The cinematography was really creative, even moving through areas normally, used some cool camera work, not just the cutscenes. Everything felt very intentional. The combat is very action-focused, and there is a mode where you can make it more passive, but I didn't do that because I want to be in control of, what's happening. You can only control one member of your party at a time, and you can switch between them whenever you want, but I wish that when someone was computer controlled, they actually did a little bit more, or if you had been able to set behaviors for characters when you weren't actively controlling them, that would have been nice. But each character fights pretty differently, so that was good. And there's only 4 that you end up being able to control since the story doesn't get to where you would encounter the other ones. The weapon customization was interesting. Typically in a JRPG, you get a weapon, you use it until you find a better weapon, and then you just equip the better one, and the old thing just goes away. But here, you can individually upgrade any weapon, so there's a little more incentive to dig a little deeper, but it wasn't perfect. And with right material combination, it doesn't really matter anyway, which is the same as the old game. You can break shit if you want to break shit. But that's by design. I was pleased with the amount of strategy that was needed for at least some of the bigger fights. It's always nice when a game gives you a bunch of customization options and you actually have to use them to achieve objectives. Similarly, it's frustrating when you have all of those options, but there's never a need to use them. And I think I talked about that when I talked about Final Fantasy XVI. I played with English voices for about an hour, and then I shifted over to Japanese. The Japanese voice actors are the ones from Advent Children, which is the movie, so that was cool. The English voices weren't terribly offensive, and surprisingly, Cloud was the one that bothered me the least. But even so, I was pretty annoyed after about an hour. I just shifted back over. Story-wise, and anyone who's played 7 remembers the story of 7, and the remake throws a curveball by eschewing the narrative that you expect, but it still stays close enough that you don't feel like they're doing it just because. It's going to be interesting to see how things progress in the next 2 installments, because the whole remake of the original game is going to be in 3 parts. And the second one, Rebirth, is already out, and by the time I get to that one, the third one might be out too. And something I'm glad was still present was the humor that was in the original game. There's these really goofy minigames just kind of thrown in there. There's good interaction between characters. And even though it's a modern remake, the uniqueness and variety of characters is still very much there. And I appreciated that.
I'm surprised you're not more offended by them splitting it up into multiple games.
I think if I were a kid, I would be. And it took me 4 years to even play the first part. It's a tough sell to say, hey, can you sink in like 40, 50, 80, 100 hours into this RPG as an adult with responsibilities?
I mean, but they're making you pay for like entire games, but it's not really entire games.
Yeah.
I'm offended and I've never played any of them.
I think it bothers me less that the game was solid all the way through.
Yeah, that's a good point.
As far as the music goes, it was good. Some neat reimagined tracks, but I felt that some of them lost the charm of their originally intended style. Like the original boss music has this just ripping electric guitar and it's this rock organ and it's so good. But in the remake, all of the tracks have this big orchestral feel, which is impressive and it's really well done, but it loses something in the process. But as far as the arrangements are done, they're top notch. And the original tracks that they did for this game fit in very well with everything else. Overall, I really liked it. I was afraid it would not hold up or it would just be a cash grab, but I enjoyed it all the way through. I've heard that Rebirth is way longer, so we'll see how that goes. And there's DLC for the PS5 version. If you buy the game digitally, you can just download the DLC, no big deal. But if you get the physical version of the game, you get a little flyer with the download code, right?
Okay.
But that is the only way to play the DLC with the physical version. So if you get the disc and you get it secondhand and someone has already used that 12-character code, There is no way for you to play the DLC apart from buying the entire base game again digitally. So if you get it from a friend or you buy it on eBay or something and you say, oh, this code's already been used, well, I'll just go to the PlayStation Store and I'll just buy it. The PlayStation Store straight up says, no, you can't just buy the DLC, which was Square Enix being a complete bitch.
Yeah, that's pretty stupid.
It's really stupid. And that's all I did this month. These videos come out way after we record them, but in real time, there was a big gap between June and July for us. It's actually almost the end of August as we're recording this one.
Yeah, due to events and things.
So how's that for detail?